For Crema Media's Polity, I'm Sane Dlamini. Fred Bridgland discusses his book titled Truth, Lies and Alibis, a Winnie Mandela story. Can you tell us, Fred, about the two disturbing events that you say shaped your life forever and laid groundwork for this book?
Yes, I'd written for many years stories about Angola. I discovered the South African invasion of Angola in 1975, for instance. I was then asked to report on the UNITA side of the movement, and I got to know very closely my best African friend. He was a man called Tito Chingunji, and he was the number 3 man in the UNITA movement. He's a very remarkable man, and I came to regard him as a brother. But at one point, Tito told me what was really going on inside UNITA, and terrible massacres were happening. Jonas Savimbi, the leader of the UNITA movement, was killing all his own top people. He was killing women and children, throwing them on public bonfires, and Tito said his own life and his own family were in danger. So the reasons for all this are very complicated and very dark. And I tried to save my friend's life by various means, but eventually he was killed with his whole extended family of 50 to 70 people. And I've decided I will write a book about that. And that was very disturbing for me, because I'd actually liked Savimbi. He's a very charming man, and very intelligent man, and that he could be committing all these terrible crimes came as a great shock to me. That, and then I was in South Africa. I was posted to South Africa for my 2 newspapers in Britain, and when the witnesses and co-accused started to go missing from Mrs. Mandela's trial, the Stompie Moeketsi trial, I thought there were a lot of similarities here between what I'd witnessed in Angola. And then I discovered in a prison in Zambia a man called Katiza Chebakulu, who was a co-accused with Mrs. Mandela, but he had decided to tell the truth about what had happened behind her house in Soweto. He claims, and he claims to this day, that he had seen Mrs. Mandela stab Stompie Moeketsi to death behind her house in Soweto. So those were 2 pretty big events in my life.
Fred, you recall a BBC documentary in which former Zambian President Kenneth Kaunda admitted imprisoning Katiza Chebakulu at Nelson Mandela's request to make sure he did not testify in the trial concerning the death of Stompie Seipei Moeketsi. Can you also elaborate on the importance of this?
Well, it's enormously important, because I used to be a Reuters correspondent for many years, and at Reuters we were told that everything had to be sourced carefully, and the more senior the source, the more certain it would be that Reuters would publish the story. In the case of Kenneth Kaunda, he had been the president of one of the frontline states, and you could hardly get a more senior source than that. And we questioned him. We asked how did Katiza Chebakulu turn up in prison without charge or trial in your country? And I can almost remember his exact words. He said, that was Oliver. And we said, Oliver? He said, yes, Oliver Tambo. And we thought, wow. And who gave the instructions to Oliver? He said, that was Nelson. And reacted ignorant and said, Nelson? He said, Nelson, yes, Nelson Mandela. And we asked him directly, he said, are you saying that Nelson Mandela gave the instructions for Katiza Chebakulu to be removed from South Africa and be put into jail without charge or trial in Zambia? And what Kaunda said to us was, exactly.
Why did you only publish the book now? Because many people are saying Winnie Mandela is no more.
Okay, now I understand your question. The point is, I've already written a book in 1997 called Katiza's Journey, and I wrote the script and I did the commentary. But there were many unanswered questions about Winnie Mandela's involvement with the whole Stompie Moeketsi affair. One of the big questions in my mind was, how was it that when she was sentenced to 6 years in prison, that she ended up not going to prison and being only given a small fine? That was one question. And also I was aware that lots of little and unimportant people had suffered over the years at the hands of the football club, Winnie Mandela's football club. And I felt all these little unimportant people deserve to have their stories told. So I did more investigations of my own. I came back to South Africa and I came across several unreported stories. And so I thought this deserved a new book, and a book which would be sufficiently comprehensive to be referred to by people for decades to come when the subject of Winnie Mandela is discussed or examined.
Can you also tell us about the incident where a brave South African journalist, I think she was from the Sunday Times, revealed that John Morgan had lied to protect Madikizela Mandela?
Yes, the name of that journalist is Dawn Barkhuizen, and she is a very remarkable and brave person, and her health has suffered enormously as a result of the pressure she came under after writing that story. But she had reported the whole of the Winnie Mandela Stompie trial, and she got to know John Morgan at that time. He was a witness in the trial, and what he was saying during the trial was that Winnie could not have harmed Stompie because she wasn't there. She was 250 miles away in Brandfort the whole time of the assaults on Stompie and the other boys. And Dawn was in Soweto on one occasion with her photographer Joseph Ali, who spoke Xhosa, forgive my lack of a click. They saw Morgan and they talked to him, and he was in a dreadful state. And Dawn said to him, well, what's wrong with you? He said, well, I'm feeling terrible because I lied at Winnie Mandela's trial. I said she was in Brandfort. She wasn't. She was in Soweto the whole time. Morgan was her driver. And Dawn thought, wow, can I write your story? And he reluctantly agreed in the end. And the Sunday Times of Johannesburg put Dawn and Morgan into hotels, and they moved them every 2 days because Morgan was in a terribly nervous state. And Dawn used to sit with him, and he was so nervous that she didn't take notes, so she would go into the bathroom every 15 minutes and write notes about what she could remember into her notebook. And his story was, look, I lied on behalf of Mrs. Mandela. She said we all lied on her behalf. We were instructed to. And now I want to tell the truth, because people in, that's right, he said people in Soweto were accusing him of being a child murderer. And Dawn said he obviously wanted to get this off his chest. And so she wrote the story, and it caused a sensation at the time in the Sunday Times. But an interesting aspect of that is that she wrote the story. She wrote the story on a Friday, and by the end of the Friday, someone very senior in the ANC, whose name I know, I'm not allowed to reveal, I'm sorry, but I'd be delighted to reveal it if I had permission. She phoned Dawn and said, what have you done? Winnie Mandela has the whole of your story. Dawn thought, how on earth had she got hold of it? And what she believes is that there was a very senior intelligence agent in the Sunday Times, a white intelligence agent, who was in contact with Winnie and revealed the contents. Anyway, she wrote the story, and then she came in on the Saturday, and her office had been ransacked, and all her notebooks had gone. All the notebooks she'd made with the interview with John Morgan and other material. And then she got another phone call from her senior source in the ANC and said, look, Dawn, your story has resulted in Nelson Mandela finally deciding to leave Winnie Mandela. And the next day, he called a news conference. It was held in Shell House in central Johannesburg, and he announced that he was leaving Winnie Mandela after, how many years of being married. It was very dramatic.
So for the benefit of those who might not know the Mandela Football Club, why were people scared of this club?
Well, I can quote someone called Nomavenda Matiani, who years ago was a very senior black journalist in Soweto, and she said the football club was terrorizing people. They were walking around openly in Soweto with Kalashnikov rifles over their shoulders, and people were disappearing at the hands of the football club, and people couldn't understand it. How the football club could get away with it at that time, because normally arrests would be made very quickly, and a lot of people speculated, and I say speculated, that maybe Winnie Mandela was working closely with the police. I mean, in fact, one person at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission years later, Azar Kachelia, who was a top ANC man who is now a judge in South Africa, he openly speculated that Mrs. Mandela might be working with the police. I don't know. I don't know the answer, but that kind of speculation was going on.
You are also unveiling shocking revelations of a gunman, Mr. Dlamini, who was allegedly hired by Matikizela Mandela to kill Dr. Abu Bakr Asfat, who had seen an injured Stompie at Matikizela's home. Tell us more about this.
Wow, it's a long and complicated story. Okay, after Stompie Moeketsi was beaten up in Mrs. Mandela's house, his injuries were very serious. There were 4 of them who were beaten up. But Stompie's injuries were the most serious of all. I mean, I can quote various people, you know, Katiza Chebakulu, Tabiso Mono, Kenny Kakasi, a whole list of people saw this happening. But Stompie's injuries were terrible, particularly to his head. And Mrs. Mandela called in her personal doctor, Abu Bakr Asfat, who had looked after her for decades, and said, please, you know, this boy has fallen off from the branch of a tree and he's injured his head. Can you treat his injuries? And Asfat said, no, that's not possible. These injuries are too serious. You must get him to hospital. Now, it depends on what you believe. What I believe and what evidence I gathered is that once Mrs. Mandela realized that Stompie was too badly injured, that's when she decided he must be killed. Okay, once he had been killed, then she realized that Dr. Asfat knew the story. Therefore, Dr. Asfat had to be killed also. And according to lots of evidence, which was heard in court and from various other sources, which people will find in the book, these 2 young Zulu boys from Nongoma were hired by Winnie, I think with an offer of 20,000 rand, and they were given a gun for Dr. Asfat to be killed. And they did the job, and they weren't very expert assassins, because they were very quickly caught. And they were put on trial and they were sentenced to death. Their death sentences were commuted to life imprisonment. And They served 24 years, and I was tipped off by my researcher that they had been released from prison, and we went in search of them in Soweto, and I found Nicholas Dlamini, and he was working, I think he was working as a labourer on a building site, and I said, "Are you willing to talk?" And I had 2 long meetings with him, and I said, "You gave all this evidence years ago that Mrs. Mandela gave you money and a gun to kill Dr. Asvat. Is that still your story?" He said, "Yes, it's still my story." He said, 20,000 rand in those days was a lot of money, and even today it's a lot of money, and I had 4 children to look after. But he said, you know, we went to jail. Nicholas Dlamini and the other guy was called Cyril Mbata. We went to jail, but he was categorical. He said, surely Mrs. Mandela should have been charged with the murder of Dr. Asvat as well. And he said something along the lines, but in this country there's no justice for little people. Big people get away with things, little people go to jail. And I said, well, what about Cyril? Can I go and talk to him? He said, no, Cyril, as soon as he came out of prison, was so overcome with remorse that he took poison and killed himself.
The book also implicates the ruling ANC in covering up for Winnie Mandela. Have you interviewed the ANC on the accusations leveled against the party?
No, I haven't.
You haven't?
No, I've relied on printed sources elsewhere and reported sources elsewhere.
Have you had a chance maybe to interview Stompie's family?
Yes, I have. I've met Mrs. Seipei several times. I went to Paris and interviewed her, and she was a very sad person. I mean, she was very poor, highly uneducated, and when I first saw her, she was living in a shack with several other elderly relatives in very poor conditions. But just recently the ANC bought her a big house, I think, with 5 bedrooms or something like that. Now she has forgiven the ANC.
What kind of conversations are you hoping will emerge from people after they read this book?
The main reason I did it was because I knew a lot of the people like Chebukulu, for example, and a lot of other people who I got to know in the course of this saga. Tapiso Mono, Dr. Asfat's brother, Ibrahim, the Reverend Paul Verheyen, all sorts of people who had been badly damaged by the events of that period. And I felt strongly that their stories deserved to be told, because people in this country, as you know better than I do, regard Mrs. Mandela as an icon. And I like a quote from the author Louis de Bernier. Louis de Bernier once said, I think the stories of the world should not be told by the powerful, but only through the voices of the small people who suffer in events. And that's not an exact quote. I can give you the exact quote later, but that's roughly right. And I agree with that. So I wanted, amid all this furore and fuss and adulation of Mrs. Mandela, to tell the stories of the small people who had suffered at the hands of her football club. That was my motivation, and I think I've put together enough information in the book for that to be a point of reference for years to come, because as this country grows, as more and more people get decent educations, questions about Winnie Mandela and the football club are going to be asked for decades ahead. I'd like my book to be one of the points of reference for people in the future.
And how would you defend yourself to people who might say that the book is cowardly as it attacks Winnie Mandela at a time when she can no longer say anything?
If that's what people say, in fact, if you read the book, I don't attack Winnie Mandela. It's other people in the book attack Winnie Mandela. In that book, I've made hardly any personal comments about my opinion about Winnie Mandela. People had said, look, Fred, when you do this book, because it's a long time in the making and I had a lot of help, you must call for Winnie Mandela to be prosecuted again with all the evidence you've got. I said, no, it's a waste of time. It's not going to happen. She is an icon, and this South Africa is at a particularly difficult time of its history, and it's unrealistic to think this is going to happen. But no, I make no apologies about having written this book. I think it's got as near the truth that it is possible to get near at this particular time. I have no doubt new facts will emerge in the future, and that PhDs and books will be written for another 50 to 100 years on Winnie Mandela.
Can you help clarify the disputes that has risen due to people wishing to have their names removed from the cover of this book?
Yes, that's correct. I mean, quotes were put on the back of the book by the publisher, Tafelberg, by 3 prominent black women journalists and 1 black male writer. And those quotes were put on the back of the book without their permission. Now, that was wrong. But I was never consulted on that. And if I had been consulted, I wouldn't have allowed it to go ahead. And at the moment, Tafelberg is in the process of apologizing to each of those people who were put on the back of the book. And once I return to Scotland on Saturday, I will be writing to 3 of them and apologizing personally, but making clear that it was not me who was responsible for those quotes being used. There's one person I won't apologize to because she made serious allegations against me. I forget what is her name. Forgive me a moment. Sisonke Simang, and she accused me of being an apologist for apartheid, and that is absolutely untrue. And there's not a word, not a sentence, not a paragraph in this book which suggests that apartheid was a good thing. And I've always been opposed to apartheid. I have an extended family in which there are people with pigments of every colour in their skin, and how could we love and support each other if we were apologists for apartheid? And finally, I was a member of the anti-apartheid movement in Britain for many years before I became a foreign correspondent.
Thank you very much. That was Fred Bridgland speaking to Crema Media's Polity about his book titled Truth, Lies and Alibis, a Winnie Mandela story.